Hi, my name is Dr. Pamela Britton, and I'm a recent graduate of the PhD program at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. I'm here once again representing the Canadian Journal of Science, Mathematics, and Technology Education. The CJSMTE is one of the leading international journals in the fields of science, math, and technology education, and strives to offer high quality, peer reviewed articles covering a variety of topics in the STEM education fields. I'm very pleased to be joined here today by Dr. Larry Bencze, Associate Professor Emeritus at OISE at the University of Toronto. Dr. Bencze joins me today to speak about his long history with the journal and to highlight some of his papers, such as Private Profit, Science and Science Education, Critical Problems and Possibilities for Action, and also to speak about his article entitled Revisioning Ideological Assemblages Through Depunctualization and Activist Science, Mathematics, and Technology Education, which was part of the 20th anniversary edition of the journal. So thank you, Dr. Bencze, for joining me today.
It's certainly my pleasure.
So you were invited to write an article for a special edition of the CJSMTE due to your long history with the journal. Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to be involved with it, your history with it, and some of the articles that you've been involved with?
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, I would encourage viewers to go to my website, which is www.lbenz.ca. So you can kind of learn about my whole career. I tend to be a holistic thinker, and so even though I've done a lot of work with the Canadian Journal, obviously my publication work involves many other publications. So in terms of my history, it boils down to having had Derek Hodson be my supervisor, my doctoral supervisor, which was a complete pleasure. I've been inspired by his work then and still am. And he basically was the founding editor, one of the founding editors of the Canadian Journal. And I don't remember the details, but I do assume that I developed an interest in public publishing in that journal because of him. I should also mention that I have now a dozen articles with my name on them in the Canadian Journal over the years since 2001 through to 2020. Having said that, only half of those were written by me or co-authored by me. The rest were with colleagues or graduate students. So obviously I was involved in those, but not to the same extent. And I should also mention that I do have a close association with the Canadian Journal now still, because I am an editor of various manuscripts that come my way. So I hope that answered the first question.
Yes, very much so. So it's a very nice kind of long relationship with it there.
Absolutely.
And it's nice that it's still continuing on.
Yes.
So one of the things is you've described kind of your research and your publication agenda as somewhat counterculture. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, basically, I wanted to give a little bit of a history of my work. As a school science teacher, back in the late 70s, 80s, basically my focus was about teaching knowledge and skills of science and technology. And I think that is still dominating school science and STEM education. But I've used the model from Roger Locke in 1990 to say that much of that was teacher-directed and closed-ended, in the sense that the conclusions were predetermined. And of course, if it's teacher-directed, the teachers were more or less controlling various steps that students would take and the thinking involved. But my work fairly early was influenced by the fact I have a master's in science and biology and ran my own research as a master's student. And so even from the very beginning of my teaching career, I promoted student-directed and open-ended research projects by the students. Open-ended is an important concept to me. It's the idea that the conclusions that students draw from their inquiries or technological design projects will be dependent on their data, but also their own theoretical frameworks that they come with, and that's going to vary across a class. And so essentially, it's kind of student-directed conclusions, if you like. So student-directed methods and student-directed conclusions was a huge priority for me, and a particular focus early on was to promote correlational studies, as opposed to experiments, or with experiments, let's say. And my first ever article suggested by Derek Hodson, actually, well, the journal was suggested by Derek Hodson, is a British journal, School Science Review, in which I promote correlational studies as a way to challenge the authority of school science in its use of experimentation as a main method of science, because of the tightness of control of variables. Anyway, I could elaborate about that, but that was a very important one, and it still is. So there's a bit of counterculture going there, but there's a longer story. So I think I could go to the next slide, and if that's okay, unless you have any questions about all that.
Well, I just one that I wanted to ask is, when you're doing some of these like experimentations and whatnot, are the students able to select their own topics that they're looking to research? And did you find that help with engagement?
Yeah, it's important to recognize this is actually, I could almost say emotionally important to me, and not lying too much. So it's key that we provide students with what I call an apprenticeship. There's a literature on apprenticeship practices. So we don't just turn them loose and have them run their own investigations like many inquiry-based learning approaches. The purpose is to get them to develop skills and knowledge and attitudes over time. And it's actually using the Roger Locke model in that slide 3. It's kind of teacher through student directed, some sharing of methods, but open-ended kinds of activities to kind of emulate research that's not too biased. It's a longer story. And it's really to prepare them, give them the skills, knowledge, and attitudes to eventually allow them to make independent choices. So when it's fully student directed, yes, they come up with the questions, and if it's technological design, they come up with the problems, and then the methods they design, and so on. And conclusions, especially, are up to them. And that creates its own problems in terms of assessment and evaluation, which I could elaborate. But anyway, that's not what we're here for. Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. So,
so I should have run to the second slide.
So how does that kind of build?
Pardon me?
I said, so now how does that continue to build? Yeah.
So, I mean, the fourth slide here, I'm using an old model from John Ziman, 1984, in which he kind of distinguishes, he definitely distinguishes between the so-called internal sociology of science and the external sociology of science. This model is first of all stereotypical. He suggests that in the internal sociology of science, knowledge is developed, discoveries are made, and they're passed on to the technologists or engineers. And then engineers use that knowledge to create products and services or inventions that get passed on to society. That's obviously very stereotypical. But it's a helpful framework in the sense that much of my research originally, much of my teaching and research were more involved with the internal sociology of science and the methods of science, as I described. But my counterculture shift has been characterized by much more emphasis on the so-called external sociology of science. And this has to do more with how societies, members of societies with power, influence science and technology or STEM fields in ways that are beneficial to them, those few with power, and I think are creating a lot of harms. Now, a related conception is Kathleen Loving's so-called scientific theory profile on the right, in which she has a similar grid where she talks about the rationalists being those who believe that science knowledge generation processes on the horizontal are highly rational or logical or systematic, this kind of thing. The naturalists on the other end of the spectrum, however, claim that no, science knowledge generation processes are more natural in the sense of being affected by one's gender, one's culture, one's race, one's politics. So in other words, the larger political and social environment and milieu, but also a person's emotions. So a lot of natural kind of and more holistic factors can influence the knowledge generation processes as claimed by the naturalists. And then on the vertical axis, the realists claim that the conclusions that scientists draw can be real. They can match the way the world exists. So what we claim can match what is happening in the world. Whereas the anti-realists would claim, again, no, that essentially there are problems that limit the extent to which one can match claims about the world, like laws and theories that scientists develop, with the way the world really is. Now, both of those are spectra. So basically, I would find myself somewhere maybe a little bit to the upper right, but I'm counterculture in the sense of my original teaching was more rationalist realist, and I think a lot of teaching is rationalist realist and teacher-directed closed-ended. I have an article in another journal about this whole thing. But my views have shifted and are quite a bit shifted towards naturalist, anti-realist views about the nature of science. And so that's another major factor. But more specifically, I don't know, do you have a question about that fourth slide?
No, I think that's pretty good. My question would have been was where did you kind of lie on it? But you answered that, kind of the upper, you started kind of down in the lower kind of left, and you've kind of transitioned over to the upper right now.
Yeah, so, there's a longer story, obviously, but we don't have time for that. So now the fifth slide, in which I report a table that comes from John Ziman in 2000. I think Real Science is the title. And anyway, he contrasts, this is a shift as well from mainstream science education to more radical science education, if you like. So originally my work was more supportive of Merton's norms being supported by school science. So Merton, I don't know if you know the longer story there, but was pretty famous for claiming that scientists should be communal. They should share their ideas. Science should be universal. It should be open to everyone. Scientists should be disinterested. That is unbiased, original. Don't make anything up, original science, and perpetually skeptical about their own work and that of others. But John Ziman reports in his book that because of the profit motive, the ethos of kudos are actually probably in many cases, not all, because I certainly don't want to say that all science and technology is affected by the profit motive to the same extent. Now, there are some fields more so than others that are influenced by that. But it becomes more proprietary, more, owned by companies, more local, authoritarian, commissioned, and expert. All of that spells place. And so I think he's talking largely, when he says place, it's a handy acronym, but it's basically saying it's much, I think the emphasis on it's proprietary, it's owned, it belongs to a certain place, not to the whole. It's for the few. And so the Canadian Journal helped me with that. As you see on the right, there were at least a couple of articles in the Canadian Journal about this problem. So one, in my very first one in 2001, and then a later one in 2008. So that's actually right at the core of my concerns and feelings around science education and school and science, professional fields of science and technology that I think are counterculture. Although I can elaborate, I'm going to elaborate a bit further as well. But any questions about that slide?
Well, I just more of a note. So you started off in or you were in like a Master's of Science program.
I did, yeah.
And then you came over to like the education.
Yeah.
So that must have because there's quite a difference between
Yes.
How kind of that that science, because I have the same background actually.
Absolutely.
And how it transitions over.
Yeah. I mean, I moved to Kingston where I did my master's after retirement. So I'm here in Kingston, but I have such strong memories of being in the lab at Queen's in the biology lab as a master's student, running my research in to try to figure out the location of a gene on a fruit fly chromosome. And yeah, I mean, it was all very internal sociology and methods of science. Not, I can't remember any kind of discussion we had in the lab over the 2 years of 3 years, because I had to write it while I was doing my teacher ed degree. But anyway, about the external sociology of science and the politics and the economics and this kind of thing. Yeah. So quite a transition. Also, I do remember switching from quantitative research methods to qualitative. So that's another major transition that I had to go through, or did.
That's a very big mind switch at that point.
Big, yeah. And I still think it divides the education fields in many cases, from STEM fields, because they do more quantitative research, and educators tend to do more qualitative research. And so there's a bit of a incommensurability there, if you know what I mean by that, yeah. So on to the sixth slide, and this is really so fundamental to my counterculture views. So this is a discussion of ontology. So this is my view of how things work. And essentially, it's not the best theoretical or visual description here, but what I'm saying is that we are all immersed, not just we, but all living and non-living and symbolic entities are part of a global network. And by a network, it's like a spider web, if you like, but each entity within each crossing point, or each point within the network, is a kind of a node that is in dialectical relationship with the other and with all the others around it. So it's a dynamic, pulsating network. But at the same time, it's not a neutral network, it's a biased network. And Foucault talks about this kind of biased network as a dispositif. And so it's like a machine to get all these actants, these entities in the world, to do what those with power want them to do. And so I think largely much of the world is governed by the private sector. People with power mostly have money, and They're controlling things such as STEM fields and STEM education and science education, if you like, but through support from such entities as many multinational corporations. And particularly, and this I don't hear much about in the literature, and it's in my last paper, is much power is actually transnational. It's not national. So there's a whole emphasis on nations and provinces and states kind of controlling things and so on. But I think much of the power exists transnationally through such organizations as the World Bank, World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and some others. There are a number of think tanks that are involved. Governments have been co-opted, I would say, without too much shame. The Trump government was probably among the worst to promote these kinds of things. Then we have a number of entertainment companies. As an actor network theory, it also involves physical things. So the actual currencies can be considered actants in this network. So for me, we have to think as educators or anyone in society as part of a larger global network that is not a neutral network, as sometimes people accuse actor network theorists about. But using Foucault, it's a biased network, a network serving the private sector. So that's my ontology.
Okay, that's yeah, and it's interesting because you can see kind of the progression of kind of how it's built and where it's come from. So yeah. You've obviously had a kind of a long journey, I guess, through all of these different areas. From all of the work that you've done, what would you say would be kind of the one or two kind of main messages that you'd like people to take away from it? Is there, something specific about your research that you'd really like to highlight?
Yeah, the big message is that because of these problems, so I'm not just staying with my views on ontology and these pro-capitalist dispositifs, but my work has been dominated since 2006 with the STEPWISE theoretical framework. So I've been working with graduate students, teachers, and others since then to run action research in which the main aim is to create a more activist citizenry. So we need citizens who are educated about some of these, about the kind of dispositif I've discussed, essentially, but also are prepared to take socio-political actions. Again, I was inspired by Derek Hodson in his 2003 article about this and many other articles. He's actually written, I think in this last issue of the journal, he writes about it again. So no question I've been influenced by that. And then I have a couple of articles. Actually, Steve Alsop and I co-edited a special issue of the Canadian Journal in 2010, promoting or discussing activism in SMT education. And then there were a number of other articles, and I've chosen one here around I did with a graduate student in which I was studying my own teaching in teacher education to promote sociopolitical activism. So we need an activist citizenry. That's part of the dispositif. We need a new dispositif that one focuses on eco-justice. So that's one of the major messages. And I try to accomplish this through Stepwise. And without saying too much, getting the students to do research-informed and negotiated sociopolitical actions, as shown on the right, requires a pedagogy that I run the students through, student reflect, teaching them something, and getting them to practice as it boils down. You can read about it at that website, stepwiser.ca, little advertising. And then the last, the eighth slide is very important, and that's the key to the last article, the 2020 article. And that is that it's sort of the similar concept as I've been mentioning. Stepwise pedagogy, the one that I've been working on for now many years, had its successes, but I would have to say it's relatively minor. So it's a terrible thing for me to mention, but it's struggled. And where it has been successful, though, this illustration is meant to show that the fact that Ontario has STSE education in its curriculum has been very helpful. So for the pedagogy on the right to be effective, the stepwise pedagogy, it needed support from the Ontario curriculum. Now, I understand through the grapevine, they may be eliminating this or minimizing this in the new curriculum. So watch out for that. But it also requires things like more resources, curriculum materials. If you're not doing these kinds of things like promoting socio-political activism, teachers will need resources. And then on the lower right, that's kind of what I was talking about before. If teachers have a more naturalist, anti-realist view of the nature of science, our research shows they are more likely to implement stepwise. But this isn't enough. I think that this is like a mini dispositif. And so the message in my article in 2020 is that we as educators can't just work in education. We have to either directly or indirectly promote the expansion of a dispositif that will support eco-justice, shifts towards more social justice, and I can elaborate at length. We have huge concerns around social justice and so many environmental problems, climate change probably being near the top, if not the top, but so many others. We need to improve the way the world is running. We need to replace that dispositif I discussed earlier that's dominated by the private sector. We need to make it more beneficial to everyone and everything as much as we can. And so that means we need to branch out our work as educators to include such entities as politicians, people in business, and laborers. And I want to mention the building of green technologies. I certainly don't think building green technologies on their own is sufficient. Again, if you think in terms of Foucault's dispositif, any one of these actions cannot be sufficient. And you need to develop a large network that is working collaboratively to promote such common goals as eco-justice. So that's my message, yeah.
Excellent. So the idea of this holistic approach where everybody's involved, and it's not kind of separate stakeholders. It's our scientists and our educators and our politicians working together.
Yeah, and we've made some progress in my project on this, and we continue to work on that. And I have a SSHRC grant to help me with that. So we've been working with, for example, STS literature, so fields of science and technology studies. And we recently did a symposium at their conference, the so-called 4S conference, and a number of other things.
Very nice. Well, we definitely look forward to seeing kind of the evolution of what you've done and kind of new papers and everything to come out of it. So, well, thank you so much again, Dr. Bencze. The work that you've been doing is fascinating, and like I say, I'm interested to see where it develops and where it keeps building to. Should you wish to read any of Dr. Bence's articles, you can check out the journal online at springer.com/42330. Once again, I'm Dr. Pamela Britton, and from everyone here at the Canadian Journal of Science, Math, Technology, and technology education. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you once again so much to Dr. Bencze. And please don't forget to follow us on Twitter at CJSMTE. And we'll also provide contact information for Dr. Bencze as well.